There's a peculiar assumption embedded in modern culture. If you're not visible, you don't exist. If you're not posting, you're not living. If no one sees your experiences, did they really happen? This equation between visibility and existence has become so normalized that we barely question it anymore. Yet there exists a group of people who reject this assumption entirely. They're the quiet ones, the individuals who live rich, meaningful lives without needing anyone to witness them. They don't post about their achievements. They don't broadcast their relationships. They don't document their daily existence. And here's what's remarkable. They don't seem to suffer from this invisibility. In fact, they often seem more grounded, more content, more authentically themselves than those who are constantly visible. So what allows the quiet ones to exist so fully without being seen? What psychological foundation supports this independence from external validation? And what can Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who revolutionized our understanding of the self, teach us about the relationship between visibility and existence? To understand this, we need to start with one of Jung's most fundamental insights, the distinction between the ego and the self. The ego, in Jungian psychology, is your everyday sense of identity, your conscious awareness of who you are, the I that thinks, feels, and acts in the world. But the self, with a capital S, is something far deeper and more encompassing. The self is the totality of your being, conscious and unconscious, the organizing center of your entire psyche, the pattern of wholeness that you're meant to become. Here's the crucial difference. The ego needs external validation to confirm its existence. The ego looks outward and asks, do others see me? Do they approve of me? Am I recognized, valued, acknowledged? The ego's sense of existence depends heavily on being perceived by others, but the self doesn't have this dependence. The self exists regardless of whether anyone sees it. It's grounded in something deeper than social recognition, in what Jung called the objective psyche, the reality of your inner being that exists independent of others' opinions. The quiet ones, the people who don't need to be seen to exist, have developed a strong connection with the self rather than living primarily through the ego. They've discovered an internal sense of existence that doesn't require external confirmation. They know they exist, not because others see them, but because they can feel themselves existing from within. This shift from ego-centered to self-centered existence is what Jung called individuation, and it's one of the most profound psychological developments a person can undergo. There's also something crucial happening with what Jung called psychological independence. Jung observed that human development moves through stages. In childhood, we're completely dependent on others for our sense of identity. Children look to parents, teachers, and peers to tell them who they are. But psychological maturity involves gradually developing an internal sense of self that doesn't depend on external feedback. This is what Jung meant by psychological independence, the capacity to know yourself from within, to validate your own experiences, to trust your own perceptions without needing constant confirmation from others. Most people never fully achieve this independence. They remain psychologically dependent throughout their lives, constantly looking outward for validation, approval, and recognition. Social media has intensified this dependency, creating environments where your worth is literally quantified by likes, shares, and followers. But the quiet ones have achieved something rare, genuine psychological independence. They've developed what Jung called an inner authority, a stable internal sense of self that remains consistent regardless of external feedback. They don't need to be seen because they've learned to see themselves. They don't need others to confirm their existence because they can confirm it internally. This psychological independence is profoundly liberating. It frees you from the exhausting cycle of seeking validation, from the anxiety of being judged, from the instability of basing your self-worth on others' changeable opinions. Let's also consider Jung's concept of the introvert and the introvert's relationship with reality. Jung didn't define introversion as shyness or social anxiety. He described it as a fundamental orientation toward the inner world, toward subjective experience, toward the reality of your own consciousness. For introverts, Jung explained, the inner world is just as real, often more real, than the outer world of objects and other people. An introvert's thoughts, feelings, and inner experiences have their own substantive reality. They don't need to be externalized to be valid. This orientation explains something crucial about why quiet ones don't need to be seen to exist. Their existence isn't primarily located in the outer world where visibility matters. It's located in the inner world of subjective experience, where visibility is irrelevant. When an introvert has a profound thought, a meaningful experience, or a moment of deep feeling, that experience is completely real and valid in itself, regardless of whether anyone else knows about it. The external validation that extroverts naturally seek, sharing an experience to make it feel fully real, simply isn't necessary for introverts. Their inner reality is already self-validating. Jung also understood something profound about what he called the collective versus the individual. Jung observed that modern society exerts enormous pressure toward collective existence, toward defining yourself through your role in the group, your social position, your relationships with others. In this collective orientation, existence is fundamentally social. You exist through being perceived, recognized, and validated by the collective. But Jung believed that genuine psychological development requires differentiating yourself from the collective, discovering your individual essence that exists independent of social role or recognition. This is the heart of the individuation process, becoming an individual rather than just a member of the collective. The quiet ones have undergone this differentiation. They've discovered that they exist as individuals independent of the collective's recognition. Their sense of being isn't derived from their social position or public image. It comes from a deeper place, from what Jung would call their essential nature or their individual destiny. This is why they don't need to be seen. They're not primarily existing as social beings who require recognition. They're existing as individuals who have found their own ground of being. There's also something crucial about the relationship between silence and depth. Jung believed that the most important psychological processes happen in darkness, in the hidden depths of the unconscious, away from the light of consciousness, and certainly away from public view. He used the metaphor of seeds growing underground, invisible but very much alive, gathering energy before they break through the surface. The quiet ones understand this principle intuitively. They know that the most meaningful aspects of their existence, their inner growth, their psychological development, their spiritual unfolding, happen in the invisible depths of their being. These processes don't require visibility to be real or valuable. In fact, exposing them prematurely to external view can actually damage them, like pulling up a seedling to check if it's growing. By remaining quiet, by not needing to display their inner lives, these individuals are protecting the sacred space where genuine transformation occurs. They understand that existence has layers, and the deepest, most authentic layers don't need witnesses to be valid. Jung also spoke extensively about what he called the participation mystique, a state of unconscious identification with others where you don't experience yourself as separate. In this state, your sense of self is merged with the collective, and you exist primarily through your relationships and social connections. Children naturally exist in this state, experiencing themselves as extensions of their parents. But psychological maturity requires breaking this participation mystique, developing a clear sense of where you end and others begin. Most people never fully break it. They remain partially merged with others, constantly checking social mirrors to see who they are, unable to exist fully without reference to the collective. Social media has actually intensified this participation mystique, creating environments where your identity is constantly formed and reformed through social interaction and feedback. But the quiet ones have achieved what Jung called psychological separation. They experience themselves as distinct individuals with clear boundaries. They exist in their own right, not as reflections in others' eyes. This separation isn't isolation or disconnection. It's healthy individuation. They can still connect deeply with others, but they don't need those connections to confirm their existence. They already exist, fully and completely, as separate, autonomous beings. There's also something profound about the relationship between quiet existence and authenticity. Jung believed that most people spend their lives living inauthentically, conforming to collective expectations, playing roles, wearing masks. He called this mask the persona, the social face we present to fit in and function smoothly in society. The persona is necessary to some degree, but Jung warned about persona identification, where you become so identified with the mask that you lose touch with your authentic self underneath. Social media encourages extreme persona identification. Your online presence is essentially an elaborate persona, a carefully curated version of yourself designed for public consumption. The more time and energy you invest in this persona, the more you identify with it, until eventually the mask becomes who you think you are. The quiet ones have avoided this trap. By choosing not to be visible, they've avoided creating an elaborate public persona. This allows them to remain connected to their authentic selves, to the messy, complex, contradictory reality of who they actually are beneath any social mask. Their existence is authentic because it's not being performed. They're not asking themselves, how will this look to others? Or, how should I present this? They're simply being directly and immediately, without the mediating layer of performance. This authenticity is precisely why they don't need to be seen. When you're being authentic, your existence is self-validating. You don't need external confirmation because you can feel the truth of your own being from within. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the relationship between solitude and psychological richness. Jung spent significant periods of his life in deliberate solitude, withdrawing from social obligations to focus on his inner work. During these periods of invisibility, he wasn't ceasing to exist. He was existing more fully, more deeply, more authentically than ever. He was exploring the depths of his psyche, encountering his unconscious, developing the insights that would revolutionize psychology. The quiet ones understand this principle. They know that some of the richest, most meaningful existence happens in solitude, in the invisible spaces where you're alone with your thoughts, your feelings, your inner world. These solitary experiences aren't diminished by being unwitnessed. If anything, they're enhanced. When no one is watching, you can be completely present with yourself, undistracted by concerns about how you appear or what others think. This presence creates a quality of existence that visible, performed life can't match. There's something real, something substantial, something deeply satisfying about simply being, without audience, without performance, without the need to translate your experience into content. Jung also spoke about what he called the objective psyche, the reality of psychological experience that exists independent of material or social reality. Dreams, for instance, have their own objective reality. When you dream, something real is happening, even though it's invisible and internal. Thoughts, feelings, intuitions, these all have their own reality, their own substantive existence, regardless of whether they're expressed or perceived by others. The quiet ones have a developed sense of this objective psyche. They understand that their inner experiences are real, that their psychological life has substance and validity in itself. When they have a profound realization, when they feel deep emotion, when they sense intuitive knowing, these experiences don't need to be shared to be real. They're already real in the realm of the objective psyche. This understanding gives them tremendous freedom. They don't need to externalize everything to make it valid. They can have rich, complex inner lives that remain private and that are no less real for being invisible. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the self's independence from collective opinion. Jung believed that the self, the deep center of your being, has its own wisdom, its own direction, its own purpose. This isn't something determined by society or validated by others. It's innate, built into your psychological structure, as natural and inevitable as your physical growth. The self knows you exist, knows your value, knows your purpose, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes these things. The quiet ones have connected with this self-knowledge. They've discovered an internal source of validation that doesn't depend on external recognition. The self tells them they exist, they matter, they have purpose. And that's enough. They don't need the collective to confirm what the self already knows. This connection with the self creates unshakable psychological grounding. Your existence isn't contingent on being seen because it's rooted in something deeper than social recognition. Let's also consider the role of what Jung called individuation and its relationship to visibility. Individuation, the process of becoming your whole, authentic self, isn't something that happens publicly. It's a private journey of self-discovery, shadow integration, and psychological development. Jung emphasized that this work must happen in what alchemists called the sealed vessel, a protected, private space away from external observation and judgment. If you're constantly visible, constantly performing, constantly subject to others' opinions, genuine individuation becomes nearly impossible. You can't confront your shadow publicly. You can't explore the messy, uncertain process of self-discovery while managing your image. You can't become your authentic self while worried about how that self will be received. The quiet ones understand this intuitively. They've chosen invisibility not because they don't exist, but because invisibility creates the conditions necessary for genuine existence, for becoming who they truly are rather than who others expect them to be. Their quietness is the sealed vessel in which their authentic self can develop, protected from premature exposure and distorting influences. Jung also understood something profound about the relationship between existence and purpose. He believed that every individual has what he called a unique destiny or calling, a particular purpose that's theirs alone to fulfill. This isn't assigned by society or validated by recognition. It emerges from within, from the deep structure of your psyche, from what Jung called the self's intention. The quiet ones often have a strong sense of this inner purpose. They're oriented towards something that matters deeply to them, something that doesn't require public recognition to be meaningful. A scientist quietly pursuing research, an artist creating without concern for fame, a thinker developing ideas in solitude, a person simply living with integrity and depth. Their existence is meaningful because it's aligned with their purpose, not because anyone acknowledges it. This purpose-driven existence is self-sustaining. It doesn't need external fuel because it's powered by internal meaning. Jung would say that these individuals are living from the self rather than the ego, oriented toward genuine purpose rather than social recognition. There's also something crucial about what Jung called psychological wholeness and its relationship to visibility. Jung believed that wholeness requires integrating all aspects of yourself, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, strengths and weaknesses. But this integration requires honesty, the willingness to acknowledge parts of yourself that don't fit your idealized self-image. Constant visibility makes this honesty nearly impossible. When you're always being watched, always managing your image, you can only show the parts of yourself that are socially acceptable. The shadow, the flaws, the struggles, these must be hidden or at least repackaged as inspirational content. The quiet ones have protected their ability to be whole. By remaining invisible, they can acknowledge all aspects of themselves without shame or performance. They can be imperfect, uncertain, struggling, without needing to make it palatable for public consumption. This wholeness is itself a form of existence that's richer and more authentic than the curated partial selves that visible people present. They exist completely, shadows and all, rather than existing only in the flattering fragments they choose to display. Let's also consider Jung's understanding of what he called the numinous, experiences of profound meaning that touch something beyond the everyday ego. Jung believed that human beings need these experiences to feel fully alive, to sense that existence has significance beyond material concerns. The quiet ones often have rich access to numinous experiences precisely because they're not constantly distracted by the need to perform. They can be fully present in moments of beauty, wonder, insight, or connection. They can experience these moments directly rather than immediately thinking about how to capture and share them. And these numinous experiences don't need witnesses to be valid. In fact, they're often most powerful when kept private, when allowed to remain mysterious and personal rather than being explained or displayed. This access to the numinous gives their existence a depth and richness that quantified, visible existence often lacks. They're living in the realm of meaning, not metrics. There's also something significant about what Jung observed regarding the relationship between introversion and self-sufficiency. Jung noted that introverts, because they're oriented toward their inner world, develop a kind of psychological self-sufficiency. They don't need constant external stimulation or validation because they have rich internal resources. Their own thoughts, feelings, and imagination provide endless interest and engagement. The quiet ones exemplify this self-sufficiency. They don't need to be seen because they're not dependent on external sources for their sense of vitality and meaning. They have internal wells they can draw from, inner landscapes they can explore, psychological depths they can investigate. This self-sufficiency isn't isolation or narcissism. It's psychological maturity, the capacity to nourish yourself from within rather than constantly seeking nourishment from without. Jung also spoke about what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to generate new possibilities by holding the tension between opposites. This function operates largely in the unconscious, working on problems and generating insights in ways that the conscious mind can't control or observe. The quiet ones, by maintaining their privacy and inner focus, create space for the transcendent function to operate. They're not constantly interrupting their psychological processes by externalizing them. They let problems incubate, let insights develop, let understanding emerge in its own time. This patience with invisible psychological processes allows for deeper, more genuine solutions and insights than the quick, performative thinking that visibility encourages. Their existence includes these invisible dimensions, where real psychological work happens, dimensions that visible, performance-oriented people often lose access to. There's also a profound connection to what Jung called the wisdom of the unconscious. Jung believed that the unconscious isn't just a repository of repressed material. It's a source of wisdom, creativity, and guidance that exceeds what the conscious ego knows. But accessing this wisdom requires listening, requires creating quiet space where the unconscious can communicate through dreams, intuitions, and subtle knowing. The quiet ones have developed this capacity to listen to their unconscious. They're not so busy performing that they drown out the quiet voice of inner wisdom. They make space for dreams, for intuitions, for the subtle guidance that emerges from depths. This relationship with unconscious wisdom enriches their existence in ways that aren't visible but are deeply real. They're living in dialogue with something larger than their conscious ego, and that dialogue doesn't require witnesses to be valid or valuable. Let's also consider what Jung understood about psychological projection and how it relates to visibility. Jung discovered that when we observe others, we inevitably project aspects of our own psyche onto them. We see in others what we carry within ourselves. This means that when you're visible, when others are watching you, they're not actually seeing you. They're seeing their projections, their own unconscious material reflected back to them. The quiet ones have understood this deeply. They recognize that being seen doesn't mean being truly known. In fact, high visibility often means being profoundly misunderstood, becoming a screen for others' projections rather than being perceived as you actually are. By choosing invisibility, they avoid this fate. They exist for themselves rather than as objects for others' projections. They're not asking to be seen because they understand that being seen doesn't necessarily mean being accurately perceived or genuinely known. There's something liberating about this recognition. You don't need visibility if you understand that visibility doesn't equal understanding. Better to exist quietly and be truly known by a few than to be widely visible and widely misunderstood. Jung also understood something crucial about what he called psychological time, the way the psyche experiences duration differently from clock time. In psychological time, a single profound moment can feel eternal, while years of superficial existence can feel empty and fleeting. The quiet ones often live more in psychological time than in the measured, documented time that social media creates. They're not tracking their existence in posts, stories, and updates. They're experiencing it in depth, in moments that have substance and weight, regardless of their duration or visibility. A quiet conversation that changes how you see the world. An hour of solitude that brings unexpected insight. A moment of connection with nature that restores your sense of meaning. These experiences exist powerfully in psychological time, even though they leave no visible trace. The quiet ones understand that the most real existence happens in this psychological dimension, where visibility is irrelevant and presence is everything. There's also something profound about what Jung called the conjunctio, the union of opposites that creates wholeness. Jung believed that psychological health requires integrating seemingly contradictory aspects of yourself, your strength and vulnerability, your rationality and emotion, your social self and your solitary self. But this integration requires holding both sides simultaneously, not choosing one and rejecting the other. The quiet ones have often achieved a sophisticated conjunctio regarding visibility and existence. They understand that you can be both engaged with the world and invisible to it. You can matter profoundly without being publicly recognized. You can live fully without documenting everything. You can exist completely without being seen. This ability to hold these apparent opposites simultaneously creates a more mature, more nuanced relationship with existence itself. They don't need to choose between existing and being invisible because they've understood that these aren't actually opposites. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the relationship between the ego and the self, and how this relates to the need for visibility. The ego, Jung explained, is just one complex among many, a relatively small part of the total psyche that happens to be in consciousness. But the ego often suffers from what Jung called inflation, believing itself to be the whole of who you are, identifying completely with consciousness and ignoring the vast unconscious depths. When the ego is inflated, it desperately needs validation because at some level it senses its own incompleteness. It needs others to confirm its existence because it's cut off from the deeper self that would provide that confirmation internally. But when you develop a relationship with the self, when you recognize that your ego is just one part of a much larger totality, the desperate need for validation disappears. You know you exist because you can feel the self's presence, the deep ground of being that exists independent of anyone's recognition. The quiet ones have typically developed this ego-self relationship. Their ego isn't inflated or desperate. It's properly proportioned, aware of itself as part of something larger. This creates a calm certainty about their existence that doesn't require external confirmation. There's also something significant about what Jung called the opus, the great work of psychological and spiritual transformation. Jung often used alchemical metaphors to describe this work, speaking of the slow transformation of base material into gold, of the purification and refinement of the soul. This work, he emphasized, happens in secret, in sealed vessels, away from observation. The alchemists knew that premature exposure could ruin the work, that transformation requires darkness and containment. The quiet ones are engaged in this opus. They're working on themselves, transforming their consciousness, integrating their shadows, developing their capacities, becoming who they're meant to be. And they understand that this work must remain private, not out of secrecy or shame, but out of respect for the delicate nature of transformation. By remaining invisible, they're protecting their opus, ensuring it can proceed without interference or distortion. Their existence is valuable precisely because they're engaged in this profound work, regardless of whether anyone witnesses it. Jung also spoke about what he called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to connect inner and outer reality in ways that transcend causation. Jung believed that when you're living authentically, aligned with your deeper self, synchronicities increase. The universe seems to respond to your inner state, creating meaningful patterns and connections. The quiet ones often experience rich synchronicity precisely because they're paying attention to inner reality rather than being constantly distracted by external performance. They notice the subtle correspondences, the meaningful patterns, the uncanny coincidences that reveal deeper orders of meaning. These experiences don't need to be shared or validated. They're self-evidently meaningful to the person experiencing them. This direct encounter with synchronicity enriches their sense of existence, confirming that they're connected to something larger than their individual ego, something that responds to their inner life, regardless of their outer visibility. There's also something crucial about what Jung understood regarding individuation and its relationship to collective values. Jung observed that the collective always wants you to conform, to be predictable, to fit into predetermined categories. Being constantly visible subjects you to this collective pressure intensely. But individuation requires sometimes going against collective values, discovering what's uniquely yours, even if it doesn't fit social expectations. The quiet ones have protected their individuation by limiting their visibility to the collective. They're free to develop in directions that might not make sense to others, to value things that the collective doesn't recognize, to become themselves rather than what society expects. Their invisible existence is actually the condition for their authentic existence. They can only become who they truly are because they're not constantly being shaped by collective observation and judgment. Finally, there's something profound about what Jung called the eternal, the dimension of human experience that transcends time and isn't subject to decay or forgetting. Jung believed that when you connect with the deepest layers of the psyche, with archetypal patterns and timeless truths, you're touching something eternal. The quiet ones often live more in this eternal dimension than in the fleeting moment of social media's endless now. They're oriented toward timeless questions, enduring values, and meanings that transcend any particular moment. Their existence isn't measured in the ephemeral metrics of likes and views, but in connection with something that doesn't fade, a deep understanding that remains valid regardless of fashion, a profound experience that continues to nourish decades later, a truth discovered that becomes a permanent part of your inner landscape. This eternal dimension of existence doesn't require visibility because it's not subject to the same rules as temporal, social existence. It simply is, timelessly and completely, regardless of whether anyone witnesses it. In the end, the quiet ones don't need to be seen to exist because they've discovered something that visible, performance-oriented people often miss. That the deepest, most authentic existence happens in invisible dimensions that don't require witnesses. They exist in the depths of their own consciousness, in connection with their eternal self, in alignment with their unique purpose, in dialogue with their unconscious wisdom, in moments of numinous meaning that need no documentation. Carl Jung spent his life exploring these invisible dimensions, and he understood that they're more real, more substantial, more genuinely existent than anything that can be captured in a photo or quantified in metrics. The quiet ones are living proof of this truth, that you can exist fully, richly, meaningfully, authentically without anyone seeing you, because true existence isn't a performance requiring an audience. It's a depth of being that's complete in itself.